Hello and welcome to Crossing Bridges. Ladies and gentlemen, my guest today is Dr. Terrence Roberts, a well-known individual not only in California but throughout the United States. Dr. Roberts is also the Chief Executive Officer of Terrence Roberts and Associates consulting firm, handling many different type of activities and needs in consulting field for countries, not only in this country but throughout the world, in many aspects of helping them with human rights, employee relationship, management rights, civil rights, and so forth. Dr. Roberts also is part of history. In 1957, he was a member of the Little Rock Nine. There were 9 students that were avoided by then Governor Ober Faubus, not allowed to go to Central Little Rock High School. However, because of the Brown versus the Board of Education that was passed already, allowing all the students on an equal right to go to school, then the government of the United States got involved and persuaded Dr. Faubus to back off, and the rest is history. But today, more importantly, the pleasure that I have of having Dr. Roberts on the show is about the things that are going on in this world and country today. And you're going to have a better perspective as far as his point of view, what we need to do to go forth together. But I need also to mention, among his many accolades and awards in the United States and throughout the world, there are 2 major awards that I need to expand on. He received Martin Luther King Jr. Award titled Drum Major for Justice Award, as well as Congressional Gold Medal from United States Congress for Civil Rights Activities. At this time, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome my guest, Dr. Roberts, to my show. Dr. Roberts,
well, thank
welcome.
you, Ned. My pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. It's nice seeing you again. I'd like to go back to 1957, and I want audiences to get the feeling of a young boy at that time who was really being denied, along with 8 other young ladies and gentlemen such as yourself, not to be allowed to go to Central Little Rock High School to pursue education. What was the feeling? And of course, most people who are watching the show, they were aware of what was going on, because I remember what was going on at that time, believe it or not.
Oh yes, it was quite a tumultuous time to say the least. As you mentioned, in 1954, the Supreme Court did rule in the Brown case that it was no longer constitutional to discriminate based on racial group membership. I was 13 years old when that court rendered that decision, and it was exciting for me, given the fact that life in Little Rock under the old regime was not too good, to say, to be very facetious about it.
Right.
So I was hopeful a little bit that something might change. So when the opportunity came in '57 to sign up to be one of the Little Rock Nine, I was a ready volunteer, along with the 8 others. There were more than 8 initially. Well, we were probably 150 strong at one point. But as parents learned of our decisions, and as other people began to talk about what was going to happen, those numbers narrowed down very quickly, simply because the threat of death was in the air. But the 9 of us were dedicated. Mm-hmm. We were convinced that we had to do something. Now, we didn't know what we were stepping into, to be honest with you. We thought there would be opposition. We knew there would be some opposition. But we thought people who were opposed would come out and give voice to that opposition and then leave. No, they were in for the long haul. So the governor, of course, sent out the guard to block our entry to school. We were out of school for probably 3 weeks. And a lot went on during that 3 weeks. A lot of court wrangling, a lot of charges back and forth between the governor and the president, a lot of people weighing in on one side or the other. But eventually, the president did prevail, and what he did was unique. He federalized the Arkansas State National Guard,
Right.
had them removed from the premises, replaced them with members of the 101st Airborne Division of the U.S. Army. And they came in and took us to school. Now, a lot of people thought, some even still think, that things were over at that point. But no, that was just the beginning. That was just the beginning. Because the people who were totally opposed were not giving up. So we spent a year in that school, but it was sheer hell. Basically, they wanted us to leave under any circumstance. Either we would leave voluntarily, or they would make life so miserable, or they would do things to us that were so painful that we would choose to leave, we decided to stay.
I remember watching TV, which was on almost every day. Of course, I did not have the pleasure of knowing you there. I was a young kid myself. But I remember how the National Guard were escorting you inside the school and how the mob, mostly students, stood by both sides, calling all names on a regular basis as you were entering the school. And the reason I'm asking you that, Dr. Roberts, is I want today's kids to have a feeling of what you went through at that time, your personal feeling, and to know how blessed they are, how things have changed, hopefully for better in some ways, and what they need to do to make sure, through education, as you have done, that change your life in a positive way, helping millions of people, what they need to do to make sure that never again such atrocities, as I call it, ever take place, not only in this country, but throughout the world. So let's go back again. Tell me how you felt as a young man of African American descent going to school.
I can tell you in one word how I felt, and that was afraid. My fear level was off the chart. I'd never been that afraid in my life. Because the crowd was giving voice to all of these notions. Basically, they were yelling out that they wanted to kill us, that they were ready to hang us. And that was not only frightening, but the fear wouldn't leave. I took the fear home. The fear was with me 24/7.
And they meant it. It wasn't just a voice. They meant it, and they could have done it if it wasn't because of law enforcement.
Exactly. And you know, I can't explain how we all survived. There's no good reason why we did, given the nature of those who were opposed. They were dedicated to this notion that we were not going to be there. See, because in their minds, we didn't belong. Our place was somewhere else. And in a sense, that was at the core of the problem. This whole issue of who controls the space. Now, until the Supreme Court ruled in 1954 that discrimination was no longer constitutional,
right.
Central High School was a dedicated space for white students.
Absolutely.
Even though it was a public school, it was in my neighborhood, so ostensibly it was my neighborhood school, but because of the law, I couldn't attend. The law changed. Now I had the legal right to be there, but in the minds and hearts of the people, the law meant nothing. Because they said, we still will control this space and it will be a white space. And the 9 of us showed up, and I think their anger was escalated many, many levels as a consequence of our showing up.
In 1954, believe it or not, Dr. Roberts, that's when my life changed. That's my journey of God has given me change to work for human rights. When I saw those atrocities taking place on TV throughout the United States, and God bless Dr. King, I also started doing my own movement, working on behalf of all people since then. And it really takes not only I or you, it takes all of us to work together in unity, in peace, harmony, to look at each other as brothers and sisters, to look at each other as people of God, blessed,
well,
given.
It's right. Ultimately, that is the solution. Ultimately. But in the meantime, that's our dilemma.
Right. Now, how were the teachers working with you, or how did they treat you while you were in school? Because I know in classes, actually, because the National Guards were with you inside the classroom and all the time you were going to school.
Well, no, they weren't in the classroom.
They were outside?
They had to stay outside the classroom. There were a lot of restrictions on where they could be. Again, the whole issue of space.
Right.
They could not enter the classroom. They could not enter the cafeteria. They could not come into the gym. They could not come into the bathrooms. They couldn't come into the chapel. But they could escort us through the hallway. Now, the teachers, they were not of the same mind. In fact, a few of the teachers actually supported our being there.
Excellent.
They were at one end of a continuum. At the other end were those who were very definitely opposed, and then all the rest of them lined up somewhere between those two extremes. Now, it was okay if I were in the classroom with a teacher who actually supported our being there, and that happened in my algebra class. My algebra teacher was a woman who was very outspoken about her support. She was able to defy that mob mentality. My English teacher, on the other hand, was one of those who hated us with vile passion. And she was very, very different. And things in our classroom were very different. So my danger level in her classroom, in the English teacher's classroom, was much higher. than the other.
Were all 9 of you together in the same class or separately?
We were all separate. In fact, you might think of us that year not so much as the Little Rock 9, but the Little Rock 1
I see.
9 times.
I see.
We were separated based on our class standing, whether we were 10th, 11th, or 12th grade, and further by last name. Alphabetically, we were assigned to homerooms, and none of us had last names that were close. So even though there were 5 of us in the 11th grade, 3 in the 10th grade, and 1 senior,
Wow.
we were all assigned different homerooms. And the homeroom assignment dictated your class schedule. So our class schedules were also quite different. We would see each other during the hall change of classes from
Right.
time to time. And sometimes we ate together in the cafeteria. But unless we had made some plans, we might go the whole day without seeing another one of our group.
Were any of the white students befriended you, became working with you? Or
Well, they did.
They did.
But not many, not
Many.
many, because the pressure was on them. The word was out very early to the white students. If you befriend any of the black students, we will kill you too.
Oh my God.
So there was no incentive for most of them. A few, again, braved the mob, stood up for themselves. One woman stands out more than others. Her name is Robin Woods. Robin was in my algebra class. She shared a book with me because often my books and supplies were taken out of my hands, snatched or kicked away and torn up. So I had nothing. One day she pulled her desk over and we shared her book. Now that, in the minds of the other students, was an outrageous act. But she said, no, I think about it differently. They harassed her, they beat her up, they chased her home. So she suffered as a consequence. And that's what the other kids, other white kids were afraid of, that they too would be physically assaulted. So again, there was little incentive for them to publicly say that they were our friends. Now I do think, as I watched the faces of those kids in the hall, I could see on some faces that they truly didn't like what was going on in terms of the treatment we were getting, but they were too afraid to speak up.
Right, right. At any time during the time you went to school, anything changed? Any improvement was made at all, or the same constant harassing, hate, prejudice, violence, and all the name callings took
Well,
place?
during that year, nothing really changed. I mean, levels were the same from September through the end of May. In fact, one of our group got kicked out of school in February of '58 for fighting.
I see.
Not that she started the fight, but other kids would challenge her, and she decided at some point to start fighting
stand
back.
up, right.
Well, as a consequence, the school said, well, we need to kick you out. So they expelled her, which was not, the most propitious thing to do. In fact, after her expulsion, little cards were circulated all over the campus. 1 down, 8 to go.
Oh my God.
So the pressure was cranked up a bit. But the 8 of us who stayed simply rededicated ourselves to the principles of nonviolence, and we determined that we weren't going to fight, we weren't going to risk getting kicked out in the same way, so we stuck it out until the end of the year. Now I say the pressure remained the same with a little upbeat in February, because at the end of the term, the governor acted again, that same governor. This time, he closed every high school in Little Rock as his way of preventing any more attempts to desegregate.
When you graduated, were your relatives, parents allowed to come to the graduation ceremony?
Well, I didn't graduate from Central.
Okay.
The schools were closed during my senior year. I moved to Los Angeles. I actually graduated from LA High.
Right, right.
As well, the other 4 members of my 11th grade group did the same thing. They went elsewhere to graduate. Now, 2 of the kids who had been 10th grade in '57, after that year of schools being closed, came back as seniors.
Oh, okay.
So 3 of the original group of 9 are bona fide graduates of Central.
Okay.
Ernie, who was the only senior that year, and then Carlotta and Jeff, who had been 10th grade, came back.
Okay. Now, you would think someone or other 9 members that went through so much hatred against them, so much pressure, tension, violence, fear, would have really become negative towards society. But I know most every one of them, from reading about them and so forth, turned their lives around, especially having had the pleasure of knowing you for the past few years. You became a tremendous positive role model. What made you change that? How did you proceed to say to yourself, I'm going to turn negative into positive, and do exactly what you have been doing for all these years, Dr. Roberts?
Well, first of all 9 of us knew that we as individual human beings in this universe had the right to choose how we were going to respond to other people. And we had all learned to respond in ways that we considered healthy. Responding with hatred is unhealthy. Responding with bitterness makes no sense.
Absolutely.
So we just cast our lot with a higher level of thinking, a high level of being. For me, it was just second nature almost. I think I must have been born with some sort of a DNA component that said, maintain balance. Because we knew also that none of the stuff we were hearing from these folk who were opposed to us made any sense. It was all illogical.
Right.
It was immoral in many ways, illegal certainly, and we tended to operate on an entirely different plane. I talked to Carlotta once. She's one of our group of 9. And I said to her, you know, Carlotta, you and I have never talked about this, but how did you manage to get through on a daily basis at that school? You know what she said? She said, Terry, I knew better than to behave the way they were behaving.
Excellent.
She said, I actually felt pity for them, but I didn't want to show that I felt pity for them because it would have been insulting. And I thought to myself, wow, what an attitude. What an attitude.
But you also came with God's blessings from good families that taught you values, taught you strength, taught you tolerance and so forth, which really helped you, because when you look back at a teenager at the age of 13, that's really the prime time of their life when they're going to school with excitement, and to take all of that away from you and for you to still pursue what you have done, it's really remarkable.
Yes, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think parents and family life, very important. And that is where kids get their introduction to life.
That's right.
And unfortunately, too many kids these days are getting messages that make absolutely no sense. When you think about, and I often thought about the white kids at Central, they had not gotten those same kinds of messages. Right. The messages they got were messages of hatred and bitterness, and they also learned things about space that made no sense. They had accepted this notion that this school was only for white kids.
That's right.
They didn't think beyond that. This is what they were introduced to, and they decided, well, this must be true.
And that's where we go back to the fact that children are the product of the home environment. Because when those children who were behaving the way they did, they were not reborn to hate, to be discriminatory, to be prejudiced, to be violence, is what they learned from home.
Absolutely.
Parents teaching hate, practicing violence, discrimination. Therefore, children learn from them. They took their learning into society, into schools, and that's how they behaved. And that's so imperative, and I want to carry on in that area with you what the role of parents are today. Because as we have seen, Dr. Roberts, not only in this country, but throughout the world, we are really faced with tremendous disparity, chaos going on. Like today, 140 children were slaughtered by Taliban in Jalalabad in southern part of Pakistan. And ISIS in Iraq, Syria, the atrocities that they are doing against civilization, as I call it.
Yes.
And what's going on in this country still. We have made a lot of progress, but my God, in some areas we're still backward with the certain shootings that took place in Oklahoma, the killing in New York, a 12-year-old kid being shot. And I want to get your perspective here. Where have we come from there?
I think we have to look at it in terms of its historical perspective. This stuff didn't just happen overnight. When you really think about it, until 1954, and that's why that decision is so crucial, until that time, it was deemed constitutional to discriminate. And we can go back from 1954 all the way back to the year 1619, which is the year the first boatload of Africans were transported here to begin their tenure as slaves.
Right.
So from 1619 to 1954, it was considered constitutional to maintain this wall of separation based on racial group membership. Now, that's a period of 335 years. Now, when you really think about it, if you do something for that length of time, when you put all of your energy and provide all of your resources to support that kind of system, what does it do? What is the ultimate outcome? Well, it's habit forming. You develop the habit of maintaining the wall of separation. So no matter how much pushing and change goes on, there's still that fundamental wall, in the minds of so many people. So what we're fighting against is not something that just sprung up. It has deep roots in this country. It goes so far down. So our real task at this point, as I see it, is to start some sort of national dialogue about our historical existence. We have to understand that we are products of that history. You know, there are some people today who say, well, I didn't live back then. I had nothing to do with it. That's not the attitude we want to see. We want to see the attitude that goes something like this. I have seen the history, I've read the history, I've studied the history, and I realize what impact it has made on me, my thinking, and my choice of action. That's a starting point.
Right.
Because we're all in that same boat.
Absolutely.
So once we begin to have that sort of dialogue, we'll be able then to pinpoint the areas where we can do the most good.
I've had the pleasure for, as I told you, for 20 years almost, being involved in a Pasadena Unified Schools districts, giving lectures and seminars. And one of the things that I instill in the children to empower them for a better future and life of peace and harmony is to go back into history. They have to learn about history. They have to understand about history. They also have to feel about what people went through, and therefore come back to present, as you indicated, to tell themselves and with parents, what is it that we need to do to make sure that never again the illness, the sadness, the hatred, the killing, violence that took place will never happen again. And bring the good things of history also forward with them and put it together now and move forth, because that is really the only salvation we have, Dr. Roberts. It's our children.
Oh, absolutely, because without that understanding, we have no way on earth of understanding the present. Because everything that we have for us now has its origins before we came on the scene. You know, I often use the analogy that at birth, we step into a drama that's already ongoing.
Absolutely.
It's been ongoing for years before we show up.
Right.
Our task is to figure out what's going on.
That's right.
And in order to do that, we have to dig back. We have to talk to people who've been through it. We have to put all of this together. And then we have to come to some recognition that there are competing narratives about the past even. For instance, there's some among us who look at the past and come back with a completely different understanding than the one that I have, or that you may have, or anybody for that matter, which makes the dialogue so important. We have to share these perspectives, and out of that, make sense out of what we are about as a group. We can't go it alone. We can't do it as a small group. We can't do it as an interest group. We have to involve everybody.
Absolutely.
And we have to put that as a very high priority. And we cannot, as some people do, point fingers at one or two people or one or two groups or one or two ideas. It's much more complex. It's about understanding all that makes us who we are, and then having the willingness to honestly look at self and others.
When they begin to understand we live in a universe, but the universe belongs to each individual, if you think about it. It's our universe, but each person is a universe. And one atrocity, one hate or discrimination against one individual is against the whole universe. And they must really believe in that. They must understand that. They must feel that. If I say something prejudicial to you, it's not against Dr. Roberts, it's against the whole universe. And when you start seeing the magnitude of what hate does, what prejudice does, what violence does, then you start thinking again. They say, am I really hurting Dr. Roberts, or am I hurting the whole universe? And I guess quite often people do not go beyond that boundary. As you indicated, for example, the white students in Central High School thinking, that's our school, you have no right. But it had perceived, again, from parents to children, from the governor to the whole society, then you begin to say, you know what? This is my universe just as well as his universe. I have rights, they have rights.
Well, such a good point. And you know, I was just thinking about that English teacher I mentioned earlier. She said to me one day, why don't you go back to your own school? Why do you have to come to our school? And I thought, I didn't know what to say to her because it was such an inane question. How could it be her school? How could it be my school? We didn't own these schools. And yet that was her notion. And if you have adults like that, teaching children, what message are they really getting? They too will pick up on this notion of maintaining this space for us, and that's their space over there. How many times have I run into that in this country? It's amazing. this whole notion about space. And I think it's an important one because 2 summers ago, my grandson was visiting from Georgia. We live right here in Pasadena. And we live in an area where our family is probably the only black family. Well, my little grandson was riding his bike around the block. At some point he came in and said this woman had stopped and asked him who he was and what he was doing, and she followed him home. She slowly drove as he rode his bike. In her mind, he was not occupying the space that was reserved for him. He was out of his space. And I thought, I don't want to upset my grandson. I don't want to involve him in this discussion because he's too young to get involved in it, and he shouldn't have to get involved in it. But I would like to talk to the woman. I could never find her. I didn't know who she was. But it's that sort of thing. If we are perceived as being out of our space, and I think this is what happens today when we see all of these young black boys being killed, they are somehow perceived as occupying the wrong space.
That's very true.
They shouldn't be here.
That's very true.
Have no right to be here. And for some odd reason, it gives the law enforcement authorities the right to take them out, to remove them permanently, as it turns out.
And that's what the dilemma we are faced today, Dr. Roberts. I could really spend hours with you, which I would love to, again, to bring you back on a show, but we are limited for time. But I'm honored and delighted for your perspective that you have shared with me. And I truly hope the young people who are watching the show today will have a better grasp of what you went through and go back on their computer and punch in the little rock 9 or the 7 and then see their videos still there and talk to the parents. And I truly hope that people will start saying, this is not just my space. This is everybody's space. This is not just my world. It's everybody's world. This is not my universe. It's everybody's universe. Dr. Roberts,
thank you.
Thank you so much for coming in. It was a pleasure to have you, and God bless you and happy holidays.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in, and I truly urge you, please, to go on your computer and look at the Little Rock 9 and learn more about what you can do to bring peace and harmony into this world. Thank you. Happy holidays to all of you, and have a blessed day.